Drop 35,000 feet below the ocean surface, and you'll realize something's wrong. The pressure here isn't just heavy, it's crushing. Enough force to compact a human body into something unrecognizable. The darkness isn't just absence of light, it's absolute. The cold isn't just uncomfortable. It hovers near freezing in water that should kill anything living in seconds. This is the Mariana Trench, the deepest scar on Earth, and somehow against all logic, life exists down here. Imagine you're descending toward the bottom in the most advanced diving suit ever created. You might think you'd see some tiny creatures drifting through darkness or maybe just emptiness, but what would actually happen is your lungs would implode long before you reach the seafloor. You're finished. The pressure in the Mariana Trench is over 1,000 times what we experience at the surface. And even military-grade equipment designed specifically for extreme depths would crumple like paper trying to protect you from forces this immense. So logically, there should be nothing capable of surviving here, right? Well, if you know anything about the horrors lurking in deep water, you'd already know that's not how this works. The deep ocean doesn't just have life. It has some of the most gigantic creatures on the planet. Massive sharks that have been alive since before your great-grandparents were born. Squids longer than school buses, and every other real-life gigantism nightmare you could imagine. But the Mariana Trench isn't just deep ocean. It's the absolute deepest point on Earth. So what actually lives all the way down there? To understand the Mariana Trench, we need to look at where it even begins. The trench measures roughly 36,000 feet deep at its lowest point, but this is calculated from sea level. The actual trench walls start around 16,000 feet below the surface, which marks the upper rim. Everything above that depth is normal, open ocean. In fact, anything swimming there, whether fish or human, wouldn't even realize they're floating above the deepest abyss on the entire planet. The trench is so absurdly deep that if you grabbed Mount Everest and dropped it upside down into the center, its peak would still sit over a mile above the bottom. The lowest point is called Challenger Deep, and this place is so impossibly remote that only 22 people in all of human history have ever reached it. To put that in perspective, more people have walked on the moon than have touched the deepest part of our own ocean. So what would it actually take to reach the bottom? Well, you'd have to descend through every single layer of the ocean, and each one gets progressively more hostile. The epipelagic zone is the first layer and the only one where humans can survive naturally. It extends down about 650 feet, and you could free dive the upper portions without equipment. But even reaching the bottom of this zone pushes human limits. After about 650 feet, you enter the mesopelagic zone. This is the same depth where the deepest free dive record was set at just over 700 feet, wearing a wetsuit. And that's only the top edge of this zone. The bottom stretches down to roughly 3,300 feet. No human freediving could ever reach that depth. The pressure here is around 100 times greater than at the surface, and your body would shut down almost instantly. Kind of terrifying considering this is only the second zone, but that's the deep ocean for you. Below that lies the bathypelagic zone, starting around 3,300 feet and extending down to about 13,000. Ignoring the pressure that would have already crushed you if you were somehow still alive here, you'd be functionally blind. Effectively, zero sunlight penetrates this far. You'd also freeze in near zero temperatures, and the pressure would be sufficient to crumple steel like aluminum foil. So you're probably wondering how this could possibly get worse. Well, here's the thing. The Mariana Trench doesn't actually begin until around 16,000 feet below sea level. We haven't even reached it yet. Past the bathypelagic zone comes the abyssopelagic zone, spanning from roughly 13,000 to 20,000 feet deep. This zone should be the ocean floor for most of the planet, and across the majority of Earth's oceans it is. But for those afraid of what lurks in deep water, this zone is only where the Mariana Trench begins. At this depth, the pressure exceeds 600 times what you experience at the surface. Not that it matters much, since you would have been crushed into paste thousands of feet ago. Near the top of this zone, you might encounter Stygiomedusa gigantea, which, if the name didn't give it away, is absolutely gigantic. This is a massive jellyfish species created specifically by deep-sea gigantism. It stretches over 30 feet across, including bizarre tentacles that look like flowing ribbons. There have been only about 100 sightings in the past century of this phantom jelly. Because they're so rare, we don't know much about their weight or size limits, but estimates put them around 150 pounds. Definitely huge, but as most jellyfish go, not particularly heavy compared to other deep-sea giants. Oddly enough, they don't sting either. They use those ribbon tentacles to slowly ensnare prey, small organisms that drift too close. It's essentially flypaper, but the deep-sea gigantism version. But at the very bottom of the abyssal zone lives one of the largest squids in the world. And while you probably assume I'm talking about the famous giant squid, you won't actually find them here. The abyssal zone is strangely too deep even for giant squids, which only venture down to mesopelagic depths. And though you might think of the colossal squid which does inhabit upper abyssal waters, they wouldn't be in the Mariana Trench since they exclusively patrol Antarctic regions. But what you would encounter here is something far stranger, the magna pinna, also called the bigfin squid. If you've watched deep sea footage, you know this is hands down the creepiest squid on Earth, at least that we're currently aware of. While it's unlikely to be as dangerous as a literal tank like the colossal squid, it's just deeply unsettling to observe. Nobody fully understands why its tentacles extend like that, or why it sometimes hovers completely motionless, suspended in the void. And honestly, most marine biologists are equally confused. They live so deep and appear so rarely that proper study is nearly impossible. Most of what we know comes from observing juveniles. They reach about 25 feet in length with those bizarre elbow-bent arms that simply hang downward into darkness. The leading theory suggests they're designed to catch smaller organisms drifting past, but we've never captured a living adult specimen. These squids inhabit depths so extreme they sometimes reach the upper hadal zone, which is so deep it's typically fatal even for most squid species. And yes, this creature represents another textbook example of deep-sea gigantism. But deep-sea gigantism doesn't exclusively make large things larger. It also affects smaller organisms, like isopods. The giant isopod belongs to the same family as common pillbugs, but instead of measuring a few millimeters, they grow closer to 20 inches across. Still smaller than humans, sure, but absolutely massive for isopods. They typically inhabit the upper abyssal zone, and while you might assume they could venture deeper into the hadal zone, it's unlikely. Plus, it wouldn't benefit them because the hadal zone is arguably the worst environment on the entire planet. This region is so remote it doesn't even exist across most of the ocean, only in deep ocean trenches, and naturally that includes the Mariana Trench. It extends from roughly 20,000 feet all the way down to 36,000. And the only reason it doesn't go deeper is because Challenger Deep already represents the absolute lowest point in the ocean. The pressure down here exceeds 1,000 times what we experience at sea level. And I'd normally offer some creative comparison, but I genuinely don't think you can imagine what it feels like to have an entire adult African elephant standing on every single square inch of your body simultaneously. Interestingly, you might expect to find the most extreme giants ever documented lurking down here, but that's not actually the case. The hadal zone is so unbelievably hostile that deep-sea gigantism starts reaching its absolute limits. Things grow bigger and bigger until suddenly they don't. The more body mass you possess, the more pressure crushes every square inch of tissue. Smaller organisms handle this better because they have reduced surface area for force to act upon and fewer internal structures that can collapse or fail. And probably the more critical issue, there's almost nothing down here. Food becomes so scarce you literally cannot obtain sufficient nutrients beyond a certain point. It's strange to consider, and most content creators skip this detail because they prefer hyping up deep-sea gigantism. But the hadal zone essentially marks the end of that phenomenon, and where deep-sea shrinking actually begins. Animals don't just grow infinitely larger, and while some undiscovered squid species bigger than giant squids might exist elsewhere in the ocean, it's extremely unlikely any inhabit the deeper hadal zone. It's simply too deep. So what actually survives here? One of the most well-documented is the Mariana snailfish, the deepest living fish ever discovered. And no, it's not a snail, it's a fish. Small and almost translucent with no scales and a body so soft it would collapse under normal surface pressure. But down here, that gelatinous body is perfect. It flexes instead of breaking, allowing survival at depths exceeding 26,000 feet. They still reach about a foot in length too. Amphipods also thrive here, shrimp-like crustaceans that can survive all the way to Challenger Deep. Some possess specialized proteins preventing their cell membranes from collapsing under pressure. Others have consumed bits of plastic that somehow descended this far, proving human pollution reaches even Earth's most remote locations. There are also xenophyophores, giant single-celled organisms living directly on the trench floor. They can grow up to 4 inches wide, making them among the largest single cells on the planet. Strangely, xenophyophores might play crucial roles in hadal ecosystems. They construct tiny microhabitats from sand and minerals, providing shelter for other small organisms in an otherwise barren wasteland. So despite being single-celled, they function as ecosystem engineers in deep trenches. Not quite as dramatic as giant squids, but you don't get much better this deep. Beyond that, there are worms, microbes, and other microscopic scavengers feeding on marine snow. Flakes of dead plankton feces and organic particles drifting down from above. Life in the hadal zone isn't some epic battleground of giant monsters fighting in darkness. It's basically die or barely survive. The hadal zone forms when the abyssal plane fractures due to intense tectonic forces creating ocean trenches like Mariana. There are roughly 20 major ocean trenches worldwide, mostly concentrated in the Pacific. The most famous include the Tonga Trench, the Philippine Trench, and obviously the Mariana Trench. But if existing there is essentially a death sentence, how do we know anything about what's down there? Short answer, we barely do. The only reason we know anything about the Hadal Zone comes from a handful of extremely rare and impossibly difficult missions. Expeditions using the most advanced submarines piloted by people with unbelievable courage. Most submarines can't even approach the Mariana Trench bottom. Even advanced military subs like nuclear attack submarines max out around 2,000 feet. You're not reaching 20,000, let alone 36,000. Submarines designed for Hadal depths are essentially pressure-proof capsules and little else. The first humans to reach the bottom were Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh in 1960 aboard a submersible called Trieste. Imagine squeezing into a steel sphere barely large enough for two people, then descending nearly 7 miles into absolute darkness. Not even certain the hull would hold because this was 1960s technology. At around 35,800 feet, one of their outer windows cracked under pressure, which personally would have destroyed me, but somehow they survived. They remained at the bottom roughly 20 minutes before beginning the slow, silent ascent, probably staring at that crack the entire time. After that, nobody returned for over 50 years, because honestly, who would want to? The next major descent happened in 2012, when James Cameron, the director of Titanic and Avatar, piloted a one-man sub called Deep Sea Challenger. He became the first person to reach Challenger Deep solo. His vessel looked like a vertical torpedo covered in lime green plating designed exclusively for depth. He described the bottom as completely alien. Flat and desolate with fine sediment resembling grey powder and no large animals visible anywhere, which aligns with the end of deep-sea gigantism I mentioned. In 2019, Victor Vescovo broke the depth record with his sub-DSV limiting factor, reaching 35,853 feet, only about 50 feet deeper than Cameron. But apparently, he really wanted that record. Unlike earlier dives, his mission involved extensive exploration and mapping. He spent hours filming extreme organisms and again discovered plastic waste at the absolute bottom. Most current knowledge doesn't come from human dives though. It comes from ROVs and landers. Scientists deploy them into the trench where they sink for hours before reaching bottom. These machines carry cameras, sensors, bait traps, and sometimes robotic collection arms. Their pressure-resistant housings use titanium and ultra-thick glass. If they fail, they implode instantly. Even with advanced technology, success rates remain low. Trenches are pitch black, freezing, and filled with fine sediment that clouds footage the moment anything disturbs it. Most recordings are shaky, grainy, and last mere minutes, but they're sufficient to prove the Hadal Zone isn't lifeless. Nearly every new mission reveals something previously unknown because finding anything down there is extraordinarily difficult. But so far we haven't encountered true giants in the Hadal Zone, and sorry to disappoint sea monster enthusiasts, we probably never will. Trenches like Mariana aren't designed to be deep ocean. They're the deepest parts of the ocean. Environments so extreme they only form through planetary-scale tectonic forces. They weren't built to house the monsters of the abyss. They only shelter whatever can endure the absolute impossible. See you in the next video.